In November 1811, the reading public of London spot a new book on sale in the bookshops and stalls of the English capital. It is already garnering some acclaim as a commentary on the social norms and manners of English men and women of the time. The strange thing is, the book isn't attributed to anyone. Its cover simply stating that it was written by a lady. Its title is Sense and Sensibility. 2 years later, Pride and Prejudice, then Mansfield Park and Emma are also published to great acclaim, but the identity of the woman who wrote these masterpieces still remains a mystery. In the end, it is only after her death that the identity of one of the greatest female writers and novelists in history is revealed. Her name? Jane Austen, the reluctant literary legend. The woman known to history as Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775 in her family's home at the rectory of Steventon parish in Hampshire, England. Her father was the Reverend George Austen, an Oxford-educated Anglican minister. Her mother, Cassandra Lee, was the daughter of a rector and fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, who belonged to a lesser branch of a distinguished gentry family, the Lees of Stoneleigh Abbey in Warwickshire. George Austen's extended family were prosperous clothiers or textile merchants from Kent. His own father had been a surgeon who, along with his wife, had died when George was just a child. It had been George's uncle, Francis Austen, a successful lawyer, who had stepped in to raise his nephew, to pay his tuition through school and ultimately university. As such, George Austen delayed marrying and settling down until he had secured a decent enough position and income. After completing his university studies, he spent several more years teaching at the Tunbridge School, his alma mater, and then at Oxford serving as a don and clergyman, in which academic circles he presumably met his future wife. In 1763, George's uncle Francis and his cousin Thomas Knight each gifted him a living as a resident clergyman. Francis secured the parish of Dean for his nephew, and Thomas Knight purchased the living for the parish of Steventon, about 7 miles distance from Dean, on George's behalf. Having secured a decent position and the use of several properties, including houses in both parishes and a rented 200-acre farm, George's annual income throughout his career varied between £200 and £300, a respectable though modest livelihood, which Austen soon began to supplement by running a boarding school at the Steventon rectory for the sons of wealthy local families. Throughout his career, George earned roughly twice as much as a skilled tradesman, master craftsman, or prosperous shopkeeper could make in a year, but far less than the English gentry whose annual incomes generally ranged between £1,000 and £5,000. In 1764, the year after he had assumed his position as the rector of Steventon and Dean, 33-year-old George Austen wed 24-year-old Cassandra Lee. The Austens had 8 children in the first 14 years of their marriage, 6 sons and 2 daughters, of which Jane was the second youngest. In 1764, the newly married George and Cassandra Austen moved into the small parsonage in Dean parish, where they would spend the next 4 years, awaiting the completion of renovations on the much larger rectory at Steventon. Cassandra gave birth to 3 sons during the Austens' residence at Deane. James, the eldest, was born in 1765, followed by George in 1766 and Edward in 1767. The family finally moved to the completed rectory at Steventon the following year, where their 4th son, Henry, was born in 1771. He was followed by the Austens' first daughter, Cassandra, in 1773, their 5th son, Francis, in 1774, and Jane in 1775. Cassandra gave birth to her youngest child, Charles, in 1779. Much of what we know about Jane Austen's early life comes from a relatively small selection of available sources. Jane maintained a regular and voluminous correspondence and remained a prolific writer to the end, but only 161 of Austen's letters survive out of the more than 3,000 that she wrote throughout her life. Most of these were purposefully destroyed by her family members, particularly Jane's older sister Cassandra. Her reasons, she claimed, were to shield Jane's young nieces and nephews as well as the general public from Jane's more shocking or biting observations or ruminations. Jane had a sharp tongue indeed, and one likely to be misinterpreted for those unfamiliar with her rather wicked sense of humour. Jane once remarked privately to her sister in a letter that a married woman of their acquaintance who had just suffered a miscarriage, quote, must have looked at her husband. It is easy to understand what Cassandra meant regarding her intention to shield Jane's nieces and nephews from comments like these. Yet it is equally likely, perhaps more so, that Cassandra destroyed these letters to protect the family's privacy as well as Jane's about much more personal matters. Interestingly, some of the earliest biographical portraits of Jane Austen were written by these same nephews and nieces who, predictably, portrayed good Aunt Jane as a kindly and dutiful spinster ever loyal to her loving family. On its face, there is nothing in this characterization that denies the truth apparent in Jane's surviving letters. She was indeed a loving daughter, sister and aunt who gladly did her duty to help support her family during hard times, but a close reading of Jane's literary works, the only other sources to which we can turn for clues as to her personality and life experiences, reveal far more complex and surprising attributes than the gentle and virtuous domesticity depicted in her earliest biographies. One item of family business which was eliminated from what remained of the writings of Jane Austen was any mention of her elder brother George, who had one or more unspecified disabilities. According to surviving letters from his parents, George suffered from fits, which some scholars believe might refer to a condition such as epilepsy or cerebral palsy. Little George may also have been minimally verbal and/or hearing impaired. In a letter to her sister Cassandra in 1808, Jane mentioned a social occasion during which she used sign language to communicate with a deaf gentleman, a skill which she may have learned during childhood to communicate with her older brother. Whatever George's particular condition, it had clearly begun to become more apparent to Cassandra Austen by the time her son was a toddler and did not appear to be developing as expected. George was eventually sent away to be fostered, although historians and biographers differ over precisely when. Some state that George was sent away as early as age 5, while others contend that he continued to live within the family bosom until as late as age 13. Matters may not have been so cut and dried, however, since George was eventually entrusted to the care of family friends, the Cullums, who lived just 3 miles from the Austen home, and George therefore might have easily visited and stayed with his family often. The Cullums also had charge of George's uncle, his mother's brother Thomas Lee, who also had an unspecified disability. People with disabilities or mental health issues were deeply marginalised in 18th and 19th century English society and considered a source of shame to their families, something to be hidden. As a result, we do not know how often George may have visited with his family after being sent away from home. The wall of silence cast around him in the family's surviving letters does not necessarily suggest that he was estranged from his parents and siblings throughout their time in Steventon, even if he resided primarily with the Cullums. What is known for certain is that while George lived for most of his 78 years in the care of the Cullums, his own family never failed to pay for his care and comfort, even in the decades after the deaths of his parents. The Austen children grew up in the affectionate and close-knit atmosphere of their home in Steventon. Both George and Cassandra Austen were highly educated and intelligent, and encouraged intellectualism and open dialogue within the family. Though she had had little formal education, Cassandra Austen was exceptionally well-read, as well as witty and bright. As the daughter of an Oxford Fellow who had spent her life in the same scholarly atmosphere as George, Cassandra was her husband's intellectual equal, and both were committed to fostering a rich learning environment for their children. Cassandra was especially active in her children's early education, teaching them to read and write. George Austen likewise took an active role in educating his children. He tutored his sons alongside his paying students, all of whom were well prepared for more advanced studies by adolescents, whether they entered university or military training. In 1783, 7-year-old Jane and 8-year-old Cassandra were sent to Oxford together to begin their formal education. Even though Jane was considered a little too young, she insisted to her parents that she would not be left behind. The bond between the two sisters had been strong from the very beginning, and they remained the best of friends throughout their lives. Their mother once jokingly remarked in a letter that if Cassandra were going to have her head cut off, Jane would insist on sharing her fate. The girls spent less than a year studying with their governess, Mrs. Anne Corley, who was their mother's cousin. Jane became desperately ill with typhus during a trip to Southampton, and George and Cassandra Austen promptly brought Jane home to recover, as well as Cassandra, and both sisters continued their education at home in Steventon. In 1785, they were sent to the Reading Abbey Girls' School, where they likely studied subjects like literature, composition, history, geography, French, music, art, dance, and embroidery. Jane and Cassandra spent less than 2 years away at boarding school. The girls were brought home in 1786, apparently due to their family's inability to continue paying the steep tuition. Other than her scant 3 years away at school, Jane's home at Steventon was also her classroom. From a young age, the Austen children were all encouraged to become voracious readers. They had access to their father's extensive library of more than 500 texts, as well as the libraries of wealthy family friends who gladly lent their books to the Steventon rectory. Jane and her siblings were encouraged to share their observations and opinions on books, novels, plays, journal articles and current events, and to engage in open discussion and debate within the family. For their own pleasure, the Austens often read aloud to one another in the evenings or staged amateur theatricals together. The eldest, James, was usually the ringleader in organising these productions, choosing the plays which would be performed, as well as writing poetic prologues and epilogues for them, which he would perform himself. By age 7 or 8, Jane began to take part in these home dramas, and it no doubt nurtured her love of literature, especially comedies. James Austen was particularly partial to comedies and directed his younger siblings in productions such as David Garrick's Bon Ton and Richard Sheridan's The Rivals. It is easy to see how such a home life and upbringing could help nurture and produce a literary talent like that of Jane Austen. Indeed, when Jane was as young as 10 years old, she was already beginning to write poetry and short stories of her own. George Austen's annual income may have been modest compared with his gentry neighbours and relatives, but it was still more than adequate to provide a regular and generous supply of ink and paper, which were quite expensive. Jane was thus able to give her imagination free rein and build her skills as a writer, while her sister Cassandra, a talented artist, was encouraged to work on her drawings and sketches. The Austen family encouraged Jane to read her compositions aloud and were warmly supportive of her efforts. This sharing of her work with her family became a tradition for Jane, and her parents and siblings were always the first to hear her newest story, poem, or treatise read aloud for them. Impressively, even in childhood, Jane proved to be a prolific writer. Between the ages of 11 and 17, she produced a 3-volume collection containing 29 literary works. Though none of these saw publication until nearly a century after Jane's death, they have ultimately proved very educational for Austen scholars, highlighting the growth and development over time of one of the most famous, beloved, and widely read English writers of all time. Austen scholars refer to these various works as the juvenilia. Jane Austen's juvenilia included her short first novel, Love and Friendship, completed in 1790, when she was just 14, as well as her History of England, completed the following year. These are two of the most well-known selections from the juvenilia and admirably showcase Austen's seemingly natural talent for irony and satire. Both works parodied 18th century literature to hilarious extremes. Love and Friendship sent up the tropes of the 18th century novels of sensibility or deep emotion, and Austen's portrayal of their typically delicate and wronged heroines, who faint dead away at the slightest provocation, poked fun at the melodrama of such popular novels. Her History of England satirized some of the most well-regarded histories of the day, particularly Oliver Goldsmith's 1774 book of the same title, which Austen lampooned as patently and transparently partisan, biased, and perhaps even fictional, especially when it came to historical details about which Goldsmith appeared to be less well-informed. In this work, Jane purposefully inverted English historiography. She professed an admiration for the Yorkists over the Lancastrians in the Wars of the Roses. She championed Mary, Queen of Scots, and condemned Queen Elizabeth. She also praised the Catholic religion and criticized its repression, another historical inversion, and one which no doubt her father, the Anglican cleric George Austen, would have found quite funny. Austen also spent an inordinate amount of ink on the rivalry between Mary Stuart and Elizabeth Tudor. Pages, in fact, quite a lot more than the very few lines she devoted to each English king she documented. This seems deliberate, and one is tempted to see an explanation in the words of Austen's later character, Catherine Morland, in her 1814 novel Northanger Abbey. History, Catherine observes, tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences in every page, the men all so good for nothing, and hardly any women at all. It is very tiresome, and yet I often think it odd that it should be so dull, for a great deal of it must be invention. It is no mistake that the complete title of Jane Austen's History of England included the phrase, "by a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian." The final polished copy included illustrations and portraits of various royal figures, which were drawn and painted by 16-year-old Cassandra Austen. As most dedicated readers of Austen's works would agree, the works in the juvenilia differ rather sharply from her 6 novels, the first of which did not see publication until 1811. Jane's earlier works, written predominantly during the 1790s, fit more neatly into the literary context of the 18th century, and they bear far less resemblance to the 19th century courtship fiction genre, the style to which Jane Austen would later have to conform in her published novels. Her earlier works, such as Henry and Eliza, the unfinished novel Catherine or The Bower, and her epistolary novel Lady Susan, were far racier, adventurous and sensational than any of Austen's later published works. Though some of Austen's later characters still exhibited the freer, more libertine spirit of 18th century literary figures like Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, they were held up as moral object lessons, such as with Lydia and Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, or as with Mr. Willoughby's conduct towards Colonel Brandon's young ward Eliza in Sense and Sensibility. Some feminist Austen scholars view Austen's early work as an exploration of female agency in literature, sensational and risky though it often was. Her later work, beginning with Lady Susan, showed a growing maturity, a move towards realism, and a growing talent for subtlety, especially when it came to the continuing theme of female agency. The heroines and female characters of Austen's 6 published novels are in no way rebels or subverters of the gendered social order, but Austen still managed to speak through them in ways which clearly critiqued the limitations on women's lives and the abject dependence on men for social status or financial survival that seemed to be the lot of all women. Another way in which Austen's earlier writings differed from her later published works was the increasing subtlety with which she employed satirical elements. Many of the works in the juvenilia are overt parodies of 18th century literary tropes. Shocking, immoral, and even violent subject matter is presented casually, even cavalierly, in an attempt to highlight absurdities and injustices. Jane Austen's later published works were far more sophisticated and subtle, but both her tongue and pen remained as sharp as ever, even though she may have become restrained by the demands of a literary market. As Jane spent her whole life largely within the environs of her family home and never travelled very far, one might speculate as to where her inspiration for such richly defined literary characters came from. Many Austen scholars believe that her colourful family, neighbours and family friends provided models and archetypes on which Jane drew for inspiration in creating the characters and stories which still continue to entertain readers more than 2 centuries later. She no doubt drew on her experience as part of a large, affectionate, teasing and boisterous family to create a family like the Bennets of Longbourn in Pride and Prejudice. Her close relationship with her sister Cassandra no doubt inspired the sisterly devotion that Jane wove between the characters of Elizabeth and Jane Bennet, or Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. Her first cousin, Eliza Hancock de Feuillide, is believed to have been the model for several characters, including the title character of her epistolary novel, Lady Susan, Colonel Brandon's ward Eliza in Sense and Sensibility, as well as Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park. Jane was 14 years old when she met her first cousin, Eliza Hancock de Feuillide, who was the daughter of George Austen's sister, Philadelphia. Young Jane took an instant admiration and liking to Eliza, whom she always thought of as the exotic cousin. Eliza had been born in India and lived there until aged 5. Her mother had been sent to wed an army surgeon rather than accept an apprenticeship in a milliner's shop after the death of her parents. It was widely whispered, however, that Eliza was, in fact, the daughter of Warren Hastings, Governor-General of Bengal. Hastings, who was a close family friend of the Austens as well, stood as Eliza's godfather and remained a supportive presence throughout her life, even furnishing her with a dowry. Eliza must have seemed quite a romantic figure to the young Jane. She was beautiful, widely travelled, and intelligent and charming besides. 2 of the Austen brothers, James and Henry, pursued her after the death of her husband, a French army officer, who was guillotined during the French Revolution. Eliza ultimately accepted Henry Austen's proposal and wed him in 1797. Since Jane Austen never married and her surviving letters indicate very few romantic prospects, readers might wonder who might have served as models for the literary heroes she created. Knowing that she spent her life in the bosom of a loving family, one is tempted to look at her brothers, in whose lives and personalities we see possible reflections of the leading men Austen readers have come to know and love. James and Henry Austen both eventually earned entry to Oxford, while Francis and Charles both left home to join the Navy at age 12. Edward, who had enjoyed a particularly close relationship with the Austens' benevolent cousin Thomas Knight and his wife, was formally adopted by the couple at age 16. Having had no children of their own, they wished to leave their entire estate to Edward, who, to honour his adoptive parents, changed his name to Edward Austen Knight. Edward inherited the Knight's estate at Godmersham Park and Chawton Village, as well as a princely annual income of £15,000. It is in large part due to her brother Edward's elevation that Jane Austen had the opportunity to venture into the world of the English gentry, who figured so prominently in her novels. Some biographers and Austen scholars have wondered if Edward might have been the model for Emma's Mr. Knightley. Jane's brother Francis, whom the family affectionately called Frank, and her brother Charles both served admirably and attained distinguished advancement and rank in the Navy. Jane was delighted and intrigued by exciting stories and anecdotes about their time in the service, and several of her literary heroes are adventuresome and dashing young naval men. Jane's eldest brother, James, chose the church, taking over the parish of Steventon after his father, George Austen's retirement. Her brother, Henry, proved the most indecisive, flitting from the army to banking, at which he failed in an unfortunately timed economic downturn, and finally settling on the church in his mid-30s. Though she loved all of her brothers dearly, biographers note that Jane and Henry were especially close. They looked alike and resembled their father more than their other siblings, both tall with dark reddish-brown hair and hazel eyes. They also had a shared sense of mischief and fun. Henry was especially supportive of his sister's writing and proved most active on her behalf in promoting its later publication. Indeed, when Sense and Sensibility was first published in 1811, Henry Austen offered to stand surety for any financial shortfall should any copies of his sister's books fail to sell. It is interesting to note that all of Austen's literary heroes occupied positions or professions shared by Jane's father and brothers, all of whom she loved and admired. Every Austen novel features leading men who were either landed gentlemen, churchmen, or naval men. We know little about Jane's day-to-day life before January of 1796, just after her 20th birthday, as this was the time when her earliest surviving letters were written. Jane's daily life very much through her 20s closely resembled that of her literary heroine, Elizabeth Bennet. George Austen's income was sufficient to employ a cook, a manservant, and 2 maids, but Jane would still have had domestic duties to carry out, such as sewing and mending for her own household, as well as working on charity projects for the less fortunate in the parish, such as knitting socks and caps for local children. As her mother began to age and her health became more delicate, Jane increasingly began to take on greater responsibility for organising and supervising domestic matters at home. She also had an active social life with a wide acquaintance. She paid calls on her neighbours and visitors to Hampshire, as well as received them at the Steventon rectory. She attended balls and parties. When she travelled to Bath or Southampton, she attended the theatre and took part in the annual go-round of the social season. Whether her days were spent on domestic or social matters, a certain portion of each day was committed to her broad correspondence. Most of Jane's surviving letters are those she wrote to her sister Cassandra between the years 1796 and 1816. Cassandra regularly spent extended time staying with her brother Edward and his wife Elizabeth. Edward and Elizabeth Austen Knight 11 children during their marriage, and Cassandra attended her sister-in-law through each of her pregnancies and deliveries. Though it grieved both Jane and Cassandra to be apart so often, historians and biographers are grateful that their frequent separations meant that they wrote one another many letters, which tell us a great deal about Jane's life and experiences. By 1796, Jane had already completed an early epistolary version of Sense and Sensibility called Eleanor and Marianne, and had lately begun to draft her next novel, First Impressions, which would eventually be published nearly 20 years later as Pride and Prejudice. George Austen offered the manuscript of First Impressions to a publisher in 1797, which, in a spectacular instance of bad foresight, they declined. It is still unclear whether Austen offered the manuscript with or without Jane's knowledge. By this time, she had begun working on an early version of Northanger Abbey as well. with the working title Susan. With such a busy daily life, one might wonder when Jane found the time to be such a prolific author. Austen did not seem to regard her creative writing as work, at least not in the sense that professional writers do today. Though she had decided as young as age 14 that she wanted to become a published author, Jane was only really free to write during her leisure time, when all of her domestic duties and social commitments were complete. During her years at Steventon, she used the small dressing room which she and Cassandra shared as a writing room. In her later years at Chawton, she used a small table in the dining room, a fairly high-traffic area in a relatively small house. One imagines that, over time, she grew accustomed to working through significant noise and distractions. For the sake of both economy and convenience, Jane wrote upon small sheets of paper, roughly 1/4 the standard size, sheets that could be easily tucked away into a book or pocket if she were suddenly disrupted. During her later life at Chawton Cottage in Hampshire, Jane intentionally left the dining room door hinges unoiled and squeaky, so she could always hear someone coming and have time to hide her work in progress from potentially curious eyes. Though Jane never married, her collection of extant letters shows that she enjoyed a few romantic prospects and received at least one formal offer of marriage. In January of 1796, her letters to her sister Cassandra were full of praise for a young Irishman of roughly the same age, named Tom Lefroy. Tom was visiting relatives in nearby Ash Parish, and he and Jane had met at a ball. "I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved," Jane wrote to her sister. "Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together." This description suggests that Jane and Tom exceeded the boundaries of propriety by dancing 2 or more dances together and by continuing to chat animatedly in each other's company throughout the remainder of the evening. Such behaviour would have inspired a great deal of gossip and speculation. Unless they were already engaged, no couple would be bold enough to dance with the same person more than once, and certainly wouldn't pay them so much noticeable attention. "He is a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, I assure you," Jane continued in her letter, and amusingly described Tom's embarrassment at being teased for paying her so much attention, so much so that he avoided visiting her the next day. "He has but one fault," Jane said of Tom to Cassandra, "which time will, I trust, entirely remove. It is that his morning coat is a great deal too light. He is a very great admirer of Tom Jones and wears the same coloured clothes." Does this reference to the fictional libertine Tom Jones suggest that Jane suspected Lefroy of being rather roguish and perhaps a bit too adventurous to be trusted? It is difficult to say. A subsequent letter of Jane's, dated a week later, looked forward to an upcoming ball at the home of Lefroy's relatives. "I rather expect to receive an offer from my friend in the course of the evening," Jane wrote. "I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat." The day after the ball, Jane wrote to her sister, "At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and when you receive this it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea there is a report that Tom is going to be married to a Lichfield lass." Some biographers have read a great deal into Jane's brief relationship with Tom Lefroy, yet it is difficult to say for sure how she really felt about him, since Jane so often wrote in an ironic or playful tone. Some have wondered whether Austen had Lefroy in mind when crafting such literary heroes as Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice or Captain Wentworth in Persuasion. Still, scholars should acknowledge that part of the temptation of taking this view is that there are so few other romantic prospects mentioned in Jane's letters. Since Jane remained unmarried, it may also be tempting for some observers to believe that she lived a life of longing and lonely unfulfillment. Her surviving letters, few though they are, do not seem to suggest such a thing at all. Rather, they describe an active and busy life in which Jane attended to her household and social duties, visited and corresponded regularly with a broad community of family and friends, and continually pursued her career as an author. Her letters to her sister Cassandra between 1796 and 1798 do suggest that Tom made a strong impression on Jane, that they were attracted to each other, and no doubt wished they could have explored their relationship further. Neither of them, however, had any money for marriage. Jane's dowry would likely have been too modest to impress Lefroy's wealthy uncle, on whom Tom was dependent to fund his education and career prospects. They would have known that the prospect of marriage was impossible. In 1798, Jane wrote to her sister that she had met a relative of Tom's by chance and had wanted very much to ask for news about him, but could not quite work up the courage to ask. Lefroy went on to become a lawyer and eventually Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. He recalled Jane many years later, telling his nephew that he had cherished a boyish love for her when they were young. Perhaps Jane regretted her parting from Lefroy, but there is certainly not enough evidence to suppose a boy she socialized with for only a month or so was the love of her life, or that he was the reason that Jane never married. The thousands of lost Austen letters might have detailed more romantic encounters or possibilities of which we know nothing. And perhaps it was Austen's express wish that such letters be destroyed, and that every little detail of her life should not be laid bare for the general public after her death. The only other evidence we have of a potentially serious attachment comes from vague details which Cassandra Austen shared with her nieces many years after Jane's death. In 1800, when Jane was 24, her father, George Austen, retired and promptly announced that the family would relocate to Bath. Jane was dismayed and apprehensive at the impending move. Bath could be entertaining in short bursts, but Jane infinitely preferred the rural village existence in which she had grown up. For her, Bath merely meant a life of the same activities under new and strange conditions, increased social duties in a more populous city, and, as a result, less time to write. Indeed, during Jane's residence in Bath, she wrote little new material, but spent a good deal of time revising previous manuscripts. She had recently enjoyed a little encouraging success, however. Just the year before, in 1799, she had sold her manuscript entitled Susan to publisher Richard Crosby, who paid her £10 for it. Since the summers in Bath were considered too hot, residents often removed to the seaside. During a summer visit to Lyme in either 1802 or 1803, Jane apparently met and formed an attachment with a young man whose name we do not know and about whom we know virtually nothing. According to Jane's niece Caroline, her aunt Cassandra seemed to approve of the young man as a suitor for Jane and believed that she would accept his proposal. They parted, Caroline wrote, under the expectation that they would soon meet again. Sadly, the family later heard, after returning to Bath, that the young man had died. Coincidentally or not, none of the letters that Jane and Cassandra wrote to each other between 1801 and 1805 survive, which presumably might have provided more detail on this mysterious and sad chapter in Austen's life. Jane received at least one known formal offer of marriage. In 1802, her cousin Harris Biggs Wither proposed to her, and she accepted. Jane's acceptance was not based on love, but almost certainly on realistic considerations of practicality. Harris Biggs Wither stood to inherit a comfortable enough estate to ensure comfort and prosperity. It would have ensured that Jane occupied an advantageous enough position to help support her family financially and remove the burden from her brothers for having to support her later if she remained single. Unfortunately, Biggs Wither was not the most charming or lovable prospect for marriage. He was reportedly neither handsome nor a pleasant companion. He was apparently terribly awkward, argumentative, and more apt than most to put his foot in his mouth in mixed company. Jane changed her mind within less than 24 hours of accepting his proposal and promptly left Steventon for Bath with her sister Cassandra to avoid the scandal. Jane never again seemed to show any interest in pursuing marriage. It was better to remain single, she believed, than to marry someone she did not love. Single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor, which is one very strong argument in favour of matrimony, Jane wrote to her niece Fanny Knight in the spring of 1817. In a letter written 3 years prior, in 1814, Jane sought to counsel Fanny, who was undecided as to whether she should accept a suitor's proposal. "And now, my dear Fanny," she wrote, "I shall entreat you not to commit yourself farther, and not to think of accepting him unless you really do like him. Anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. And if his deficiencies of manner strike you more than all his good qualities, if you continue to think strongly of them, give him up at once." In 1805, Jane's life changed dramatically when her father died. The family no longer had George Austen's income from the parishes of Steventon and Dean, and thus Jane, Cassandra, and their mother became almost totally reliant on the Austen brothers to support them, which, to their credit, they did as faithfully as they were able. Fortunately, there were 6 brothers, and together they managed to pool enough money every year to support their mother and sisters, though Frank, Charles, and Henry struggled mightily to continue doing so after the failure of Henry's bank in 1816. Cassandra had inherited a little money as well from a fiancé who had died in 1797, and during the next few years, Jane finally began to enjoy some financial success from her writing, which also helped support the Austen women. Following George Austen's passing, Mrs. Austen and her daughters remained in Bath for a few months, after which they spent the next few years moving around to the homes of various relatives. They spent most of this time in Southampton, where they stayed with Frank Austen and his wife. In 1808, Edward Austen Knight offered his mother and sisters a 6-bedroom cottage on his estate in Chawton, Hampshire, quite close to Steventon, where the Austens had grown up. Jane lived there until her death less than 10 years later. With their income much more restricted, Jane, Cassandra, and their mother rarely entertained anyone other than close family, and they attended only the few social occasions which decency demanded of them. As a result, Jane was able to be quite dedicated to her writing during her years at Chawton. In 1809, she sought to repurchase her novel Susan from Richard Crosby, the publisher to whom she had sold it 10 years before. Though Crosby had advertised the book after he received the manuscript, he had never actually published it. Jane managed to buy it back from him at the same price for which she had sold it, £10, but she could not afford to do so until 1816. After the move to Chawton, she spent some months revising the manuscript of Elinor and Marianne, and in 1811 she finally managed to find a publisher for it. Thomas Egerton agreed to publish an initial print run of less than 1,000 copies of the novel entitled Sense and Sensibility. Like the vast majority of 19th century female writers, Jane published her books anonymously. It was generally considered unseemly, even unfeminine, for a woman to publish under her own name, since it suggested that she had chosen a profession, a very masculine concept, above her traditional domestic duties. The line beneath the title of Sense and Sensibility read simply, "By a Lady." The novel's first run sold out within 2 years, and Egerton was quick to accept Austen's second publication, Pride and Prejudice, in 1813. The success of Austen's first novel was manifest. The line beneath the title of Pride and Prejudice read, "By the author of Sense and Sensibility." This book saw 2 sold-out print runs within less than a year, and in 1814, Egerton published Austen's third book, Mansfield Park, which was also an instant success with readers. Emma was the last of Austen's novels to be published during her lifetime, in 1815, with an impressive print run of 2,000 copies, more than half of which sold within the year. When Emma went to publication, Jane reworked her manuscript titled The Elliots, which would eventually be released posthumously under the title Persuasion. She also began work on a new novel entitled The Brothers, but she died before it was completed. It was eventually published in 1924 under the title Sanditon. Despite the undoubted commercial success of her books during the last few years of her life, Jane remained as committed as ever to her craft, but also strongly protective of her privacy and anonymity. She did not wish to be publicly known as the author of her works. She was thus understandably frustrated with her brother Henry when he let it slip to a pair of aristocratic acquaintances that the celebrated mystery author was, in fact, his sister. This may have been the reason why the Prince Regent, eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, found out about Jane's identity. Jane was contacted in 1814 by the Prince Regent's librarian, James Stanier Clark, who expressed his own as well as the Prince's admiration for Jane's novels and invited her to view the Prince's library collection, an invitation she gladly accepted. To Jane's dismay, however, Clark then invited her to dedicate her next novel to the Prince and gave her a long list of suggestions that she might want to employ in a subsequent work. The offer of the dedication was a significant honour which Jane could hardly refuse. Much as she privately loathed the Prince Regent for his libertinism and his callous treatment of his wife, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, Jane dutifully dedicated Emma to the Prince Regent, but utterly lambasted Clarke's literary guidance. After her visit with him, she wrote her satirical Plan of a Novel, which poked fun at Clarke and his inflated literary pretensions. By the late summer of 1815, Jane's health began to fail visibly. She began to have regular bouts of illness, including colds, fevers, and digestive distress. Her complexion altered, and she found herself dogged by tiredness. Valiantly, she continued to work through 1816 and through the winter of early 1817 on the final drafts of Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, as well as beginning work on Sanditon. In the spring of the year, however, she finally acknowledged her inability to continue and laid down her pen. Medical historians still differ over the nature of Austen's final illness. A 1964 paper posited that her symptoms during the last 2 years of her life suggest that she was in the last stages of Addison's disease. More recent theories posit that Jane's final illness was in fact Hodgkin's lymphoma. In May of 1817, still in hopes of treatment or a cure, Cassandra and Jane removed to Winchester so that Jane could be under the care of a specialist. Though exhausted, weakened, and constantly racked by pain, she was as sharp and as cheerful as ever. She lived less than 2 months after her arrival in Winchester. Jane Austen died quietly in lodgings in College Street on the 18th of July, 1817, at the age of 41. Her beloved sister Cassandra was with her to the end, holding her hand while Jane's head rested in Cassandra's lap. She was laid to rest in Winchester Cathedral beneath a carved epitaph lovingly composed by her eldest brother James. In it, he praised her charity, devotion, faith, and purity, as well as the extraordinary endowments of her mind. No mention was made regarding her love and mastery of literature or of her success as an author. A year after her death in 1818, Jane's brother Henry initiated the publication of her last 2 novels, Persuasion and the oft-revised Northanger Abbey. In 1832, all 6 of Jane Austen's novels were published as part of a standard novel series, dramatically increasing their already impressive circulation and popularity. In nearly 200 years since the set's release, Austen's books have never been out of print. In fact, it is fair to say that next to Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare, Jane Austen is probably the most popular and best-loved writer in English history. Her books have been translated into a huge range of languages, have inspired numerous literary, theatrical, and film adaptations, and have shown impressive resiliency over time. Austen's characters, prose, and wisdom still resonate with readers today. Even those who dislike comedies of manners or find courtship fiction vacuous or bourgeois in the extreme are forced to admit Austen's gift for elegant prose and satirical subtlety. Jane has been credited with pioneering the literary device known as free indirect speech, which refers to the author's ability to enter into the thoughts and perspectives of characters without taking on first-person narration. Scholars continue to differ over the exact nature of Jane's intentions in many of her writings. Some see her as a fundamental conservative, one content to see the social class and gender status quo preserved, while others insist that she used her characters to subtly criticize class discrimination, inequality, and social and economic limitations on women's lives in general. Some have also identified criticism of international issues, such as the slave trade, specifically in Mansfield Park. The debate surrounding the politics of Jane Austen is likely to continue, for both sides offer fairly well-reasoned arguments. Jane's letters and literary works clearly illustrate that she was no rebel, no subverter of the social order. Her sarcasm and sharp tongue were legendary with those closest to her, but were in no way public knowledge. She observed feminine propriety by adamantly refusing to seek notoriety, and all of her books were published anonymously until after her death. She lived through some of the most tempestuous geopolitical times in history, yet they hardly seemed to touch her. She was born just before the outbreak of the American Revolution. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars formed the international backdrop throughout her life. Yet both her letters and her literature show barely any acknowledgement of the enormous upheaval taking place throughout the world. Jane and her family had followed the events of the French Revolution with horror. The Austens had no Republican sympathies whatsoever, but were fully committed to God, King, and country. The argument may convincingly be made that there was little of the progressive to be seen in the works of Jane Austen. And yet, one has only to immerse oneself in the experiences of one of Austen's literary heroines to sense her unmistakably critical view of women's lack of education, freedom, or self-determination. Jane Austen was no Mary Wollstonecraft. Her literary contemporary and an openly passionate critic of women's treatment in society. Jane's own upbringing as a rural English clergyman's daughter would hardly have permitted her to become such a radical. She was, nonetheless, part of a groundswell of changing ideas and opinions that presaged the coming of the modern feminist movement. Her books were not only a literary bridge between the Romanticism of the 18th century and the realism of the 19th century, but also a bridge between the world of the Enlightenment and the modern world. When it comes to such literature, one must concede that two things may be true at the same time. What do you think of Jane Austen? Why have her novels remained so consistently popular and beloved for over 200 years? What is it about her much smaller body of work, compared to the far more prolific Shakespeare and Dickens, that continually serves to place her alongside these literary giants? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.